Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another True North Report. My name is Andrew Lawton, fellow with True North, with you to unpack the latest and greatest of the SNC-Lavalin scandal. And I will preface this by saying that I deserve a medal because I have suffered through, I think, about 7 hours of parliamentary testimony today so that you don't have to. I will condense what happened in that 7 hours to a good, manageable, 7-minute chunk for you. And I deserve the Order of Canada for that because I don't even think the people in the committee room were listening for all 7 hours. But I did it. I made it through it. I'm very glad that I worked from home and I could just camp out on my couch for the 7 hours because doing it at a desk would have been very unpleasant. Almost as unpleasant as being on the receiving end of a cross-examination by Lisa Raidd, which I think is probably right up there with, the Chinese torture you read about. She is just so effective in that role. I would not want to be in the hot seat when she is questioning. But thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. We have a lot to really get through here. And I have to stress, when I say that being cross-examined by Lisa Raidd is probably like going through Chinese torture, I don't mean that she's wrong. I just mean that it's not going to be pleasant. It was very pleasant to watch. Lisa Raidd just absolutely killed it today. I think there were a lot of conservatives and a lot of Canadians that were watching this. If you, like me, were going through the 7 hours and just literally on the edge of the seat going yeah, you go. It was actually more interesting to watch her than it was to watch the first 80% of this year's Super Bowl. Now, admittedly, that's not saying much because I think, watching paint dry was more exciting than the first 80% of this year's Super Bowl. But it was great. I mean, because she wasn't just entertaining to watch. The reason she was entertaining was because she was actually pointing out the logical inconsistencies that were coming from the testimonies of Michael Wernick and also the testimony of Gerald Butts. And this is hugely important. This is so tremendously important right now because this situation has become a he said, she said, he said, she said situation. I mean, there's no way around that. Jody Wilson-Raybould testified last week. I covered it extensively. I thought it was a very good testimony. But still, we have to rely a lot on Jody Wilson-Raybould's own memories, recollections, and contemporaneous notes. And I think the word of the day today was contemporaneous. If you were taking a shot every time someone said contemporaneous, you are right now sprawled, passed out on the ground outside committee room in Parliament. And the other part of this is that the versions we heard today were not really much better fleshed out. They were coming from the notes and memories and recollections of Gerald Butts and of Michael Wernick and of Nathalie Drouin, who's the Deputy Minister of Justice, and she testified today alongside Michael Wernick. So this is where I want to go with this here, because when push comes to shove, I want to separate the testimonies of Gerald Butts and Michael Wernick. I felt that, in all honesty, Gerald Butts was a more reliable witness than Michael Wernick. And when I say that, I don't mean that I believe everything that he said, but he was a more reliable witness in the sense that when he testified, there was a ring of truth to it. He gave a very good explanation, I thought, for why the cabinet shuffle took place. He believes and is claiming, as though he believes, that Jody Wilson-Raybould's demotion to Veterans Affairs had absolutely nothing to do with the SNC-Lavalin case. One of the interesting perspectives I've seen online is that it seems like he may actually believe this, like his government and his party and his office has talked itself into believing it. Whereas you take Michael Wernick was flippant, he was smug, he was defensive, he was very glib about all of this. And the one takeaway that I got from Michael Wernick here is that this is a man who should lose his job, not just for what may have happened in the SNC-Lavalin case, but here's a guy who should probably lose his job simply for the approach that he has with his career. And I'm going to read a couple of quotes that came that I think illustrate this, but I want to go through really point by point a lot of the issues that came up today. Gerald Butts started his testimony with, of course, the Aboriginal land acknowledgement, because that is just what you have to do when you're a white person in Ottawa. You have to make it about Aboriginal affairs. And Gerald Butts does it, and then he says that he's not here to say a bad word about former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould. He's got a lot of respect. He doesn't want to disparage her. He's not going to be mean to her. And then, like, immediately after that, he says, but, I'm here because, I just disagree with, everything she said last week, and I think that her characterization of this stuff needs to be corrected. So he basically says, and this is like the condensed version of what Gerry Butts said, I'm not here to say a bad word about her, but everything she said was a lie, and here's why. So, but he refused every single time he was asked to go down that road of saying, yes, I am saying she's wrong. Yes, I'm saying she's lying. Yes, I'm saying she's remembered this incorrectly. So he doesn't even have the fortitude to really come out guns blazing and say, yeah, you know what, I think that she is wrong and we're right, and this is what the truth of the matter is. So that I find interesting, and I don't know if it's that they don't want to get pulled into this, quagmire of having to be calling a woman a liar. But I mean, this is the identity politics. If you live by the identity politics sword, you're going to die by it. But I found that very interesting. So he's like, yeah, we're not here to say a bad word about her, but she's a dirty, stinking liar. And yeah, so what do you want to ask me, folks? But he was very candid. When he talks about the timeline of the meetings that were had between the Prime Minister's office and Jody Wilson-Raybould's office, he said, and this is an exact quote that I took I can't even say the word now, contemporaneously. I said contemporaneous, so I've got to take a drink now, excuse me. He said, all we ever asked the Attorney General to do was consider a second opinion. So that's key. All we ever asked the Attorney General to do was consider a second opinion. Now, this implies a couple of things. Number one, it implies that apparently they don't believe Jody Wilson-Raybould thought of all of the circumstances and situations and permutations and conjugations of this before making her decision. It says that, no, we actually don't believe that she did all of this beforehand. And also it says that we didn't respect when she had reached the conclusion. And this is so critical here because Gerald Butts said unequivocally that he didn't know Jody Wilson-Raybould had made a decision until last week. So she made a decision September, I think it was 16th or 19th. He says, no, I only learned, last week when she testified that she apparently made a decision then. Michael Wernick this afternoon, just about an hour ago, testified to the contrary, that he knew Jody Wilson-Raybould had made a decision back in September. But he said, despite her making that decision, it was never a legally binding or legally final decision because the Attorney General has the purview to make a decision up until the point a judge renders a verdict. And this is a lengthy legal way of saying that one of the things that really came up here is that Jody Wilson-Raybould may have in her own mind come to a conclusion, but she still could have changed it. And she was within that time frame of when she could have changed her mind. So this is fascinating because Michael Wernick's admitting that conversations he had with Jody Wilson-Raybould after she had made up her mind were part of that whole considering her to give a second opinion thing that Gerald Butts had indicated. And this is fascinating because, Michael Wernick is not supposed to be the guy that is driving policy. He's not supposed to be the guy that's driving an agenda. He's not supposed to be the guy that is driving what a government is deciding. He's the guy who is the head of the civil service, the head of the federal public service, the top-ranking bureaucrat in Canada's government. He's supposed to be there to make the trains run on time and to implement whatever the government has decided. But he was going beyond that role and actually, as I said last week, running interference. And this was the allegation that Jody Wilson-Raybould had made. And when it comes to, that whole policy that they were pushing to give a deferred prosecution agreement to, not just to give a deferred prosecution agreement to SNC-Lavalin, but to interfere in the prosecutor's decision and then doing it. And this is what Gerald Butts said. He said, yes, we were trying to raise the 9,000 jobs in Quebec, the 9,000 jobs here, the 9,000. We kept hearing it, 9,000 jobs, 9,000 jobs. And he says that this is something that they were considering and that the government had an obligation to consider it. And he even at one point, Jerry Butts started talking about his upbringing in Cape Breton and trying to bond with Lisa Raitt, because that's how he's scared, when he's I'm afraid of Lisa Raitt's questions, so I'm just gonna try to bond with her about growing up in Cape Breton or something. It didn't work, but he said, oh yes, when the coal mines would shut down there and we'd all be very sad. And he was talking about this, but the job considerations are political considerations. And it doesn't mean they're not justifiable political considerations, but they are political considerations. But there was a point that Jerry Butts actually admitted that he was bringing up this dialogue, and his office was bringing up this dialogue. But he says that protecting Quebec jobs is not a political consideration, it's a public policy consideration. So he admitted, and this is what happened today, he admitted doing what Jody Wilson-Raybould accused him of doing, but where she views it as political interference, they're saying, no, it's not, because they're trying to put it under the mask of public policy. Well, public policy is a reflection of the political agenda of a country and of a government. And this is something that's very important, and this is not something that was first brought up to the government when the Globe and Mail story came up. And this was what I would say is probably one of the juicier revelations from Scott Bryson's testimony. He said that when the cabinet shuffle took place in January and they were trying to do everything because Scott Bryson left, that was another take a drink moment there, all the Scott Bryson references. But Scott Bryson left cabinet. They needed to find a Treasury Board president. Jane Philpott goes over. Then that leaves Indigenous Services. Jody Wilson-Raybould didn't want Indigenous Services because she rejects the Indian Act, which I don't fault her for. So they have to find a role for her. But Jody Wilson-Raybould apparently said to the Prime Minister in January, I've got concerns about this shuffle. Jody Wilson-Raybould's going to feel it's a demotion. And, she's probably going to think it has to do with this SNC-Lavalin thing. And Gerald Butts called this far-fetched. And he said Trudeau was surprised by the question and didn't really care about the implication that someone might think that and someone might raise that question. So this whole thing happens. This timeline is laid out by Jerry Butts. And what was interesting here is that this tells us very little that we didn't already know. I mean, we got a little bit more color about the cabinet process, but again, he admitted that yes, they were trying to get Jody Wilson-Raybould to take into consideration a second perspective and a second opinion, and telling her, we'll even hire a former Supreme Court justice to help you get some outside legal advice. Well, repeatedly telling her the decision is yours, the decision is yours, the decision is yours. And one thing strikes me as odd here, and I want to compare this to the Michael Cohen testimony we had last week. Not that I see similarities in the people or the situations, but the narrative, where one thing that Michael Cohen said that I found interesting was that, Trump would never tell him something outright. He would just say, this is the way it's going to be. And Trudeau, Butts, Wernick have all said repeatedly, no. In fact, we kept telling her. We kept telling her the decision was hers. We kept pointing out, it's your decision, Jody Wilson-Raybould. It's your decision, it's your decision, it's your decision. And it sounds like they were trying to make that claim more for the record than for the truth of the matter. It sounds like they wanted to make sure that there was something that they could look back and say, no, we kept telling her the decision is hers. Like, that's only something you do if you're trying to overcompensate for interfering. That's the only thing that you really do when you're actually interfering, is you try to lay down all this evidence of, no, I'm not interfering. I'm not taking away your right. I'm not saying you can't do this. And that seems very deliberate. When all of these people have said, no, I know. Because again, they're all saying, well, I don't recall that. I don't recall that. I don't recall that. But I recall saying this. So they're either making it up after the fact, or they said it specifically for this point so that they know if they were to look back on it, they could say, yes, we told her the decision was hers and hers alone. Maybe it was said, however, with a bit of a wink. So this was, I think, the crux of Gerald Butts' testimony here. and why there were some concerns with it. And what was interesting is that he was reading all of these old text messages, emails. One of the questions that I raised, thankfully Lisa Raitt raised it in committee, was how did he have access to his Prime Minister's office email, text messages, phone records, all of that. He claims that he got it through his lawyer. So he went to his lawyer and said, you know, I need all of this information. His lawyer procured it for him. The Liberals legitimately on the committee voted against supplying that evidence to the committee. So the text messages that he was reading, the emails he was reading, the calendar logs, the phone logs, all of these relevant details, the Conservatives, or sorry, not the Conservatives, the NDP put a motion forward saying, have these admitted into evidence. No, sorry, it was Lisa Raitt that put it forward. And the Liberals voted against it. So the Liberals legitimately voted against the committee that they sit on having the required and necessary evidence to do its investigatory duties. And we're supposed to believe that they're not viewing this as, or turning this into a sham. They also voted against having Gerald Butts sworn in under oath. They voted against having Michael Wernick sworn in under oath. They voted against having Nathalie Drouin sworn in under oath. So the Liberals have actually voted against, on the record, recorded under their names, a recorded vote, doing the things that you would require to have something have a little bit more oomph and a little bit more clout in these things. So this is, I think, a fascinating turn of events. The Liberals are not even pretending that they support this process and they support having some teeth to their committee on here. And Michael Wernick has treated this as a farce as well. His very first thing, not even in his statement, but before his statement, he held up this big dossier of things, and he's like, I'm submitting into the record basically mean tweets that he was getting. So this is laughable. He was saying that, you know, Michael Wernick has been getting mean tweets from people across Canada on his official Twitter account, clerk_GC or whatever. So he was submitting like printouts of the mean tweets because he thought that all of a sudden he was appearing on Jimmy Kimmel and that he would get the opportunity to read them later on. And we're supposed to believe that Canadians responding to his allegations of impropriety are somehow exculpatory. I don't quite know how that is, but he said that it amounts to intimidation of a witness before a committee. So this is the guy, 37-year career public servant. He's seen it all. He's been through governments, liberal governments, conservative, and he gets a bunch of mean tweets in a week, and he's like, you know, crying boo-hoo about it and claiming that he was intimidated. So he may have been testifying today under duress. I suppose we'll find out soon enough if this is the case. Julian Siegel writes on Facebook, asking no matter how nicely or courteously for reconsideration is interfering. Yeah, no, you're very right about that, Julian. And this is, of course, a response to Gerald Butts' claim that, you know, all he was doing was trying to make sure that Jody Wilson-Raybould was considering a second opinion. Well, when she has decided, and when she has made it clear to a number of people, not to Gerald Butts, he says, but made it clear to a number of people that she has decided, saying, well, have you thought about this? That's pressure. That is interference when she has already made up her mind. But I want to focus a bit more on the Wernick side of things here, because he admitted, so Jody Wilson-Raybould accused him of raising the fact that Quebec had an election coming up as being a concern. He did not dispute that allegation. He says, yeah, I did it. I raised that, not because it was a political concern, but because, you know, we as a government federally are generally speaking supposed to stay out of provincial issues. And if we do this, it might cause issues in the Quebec election. So, which, I mean, he's splitting hairs. He's defending it, but he's admitting that he did it. He's admitting that he raised those concerns, which Jody Wilson-Raybould took as someone saying, yeah, we've got some political considerations here. And remember, this was the conversation where Trudeau, based on Jody Wilson-Raybould's allegations, said, I am a member of Parliament in Quebec. I am the MP for Papineau. So Michael Wernick says what he was accused of saying is true, that, yes, he raised Quebec election issues with Jody Wilson-Raybould. But I wanted to go to a quote that he gave about what his role is, because the bigger question here than did the government interfere in the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin, or did it try to interfere, is whether Michael Wernick has been running as the chief non-partisan bureaucrat in Canada, non-partisan, political interference for the Liberals. And there seems to be a lot of evidence mounting today that suggests, yes, in fact, he is. And he was trying to explain his role. And again, this may just be a wording issue. Maybe I'm the one splitting hairs here. I'm going to read the words, explain my thought process. If you disagree with me, please do tell me in the comments. They're down there in some corner, I don't know. They're down there on your screen, though. He says, part of my job is to keep the government's agenda moving. Now, again, this is, I'm entirely possibly reading too much into this, but he said unequivocally, part of my job is to keep the government's agenda moving. The word agenda starts talking about the political implications of what Justin Trudeau's government is trying to do. Advise, counsel, yes, but agenda means that he is basically spinning for what Trudeau is doing. And when Trudeau's government was at odds with the Attorney General, who is supposedly a non-partisan role, but a partisan figure. And this is the interesting thing. The Attorney General of a country is supposed to be independent, but she's a member of the cabinet. She's a Liberal MP. It's difficult to split the Minister of Justice hat from the Attorney General hat. But her decision was one. Trudeau, as a political figure, had a different perspective. And even though the government position was what the Attorney General decided, he was lobbying the Attorney General with the Prime Minister. And I know this is confusing and circular, and we're talking about figures here that are real people, but I'm talking about them in the roles because this is where it gets so significant. So what Wernick was doing was actually lobbying. He was not enacting the agenda. What should happen is he gets the marching orders and he says, okay, this is what we're doing. This is what the government of the day has decided. So it's difficult to not see that he has a political role that he has been playing. Brad writes, it's pathetic what the Liberals are doing. JB writes here, I love the eye roll of the chairman of the Justice Committee. Shows how much the Liberals think of the inquiry. And let's see, Elizabeth writes, terrible government. Kevin writes, agreed. The not-so-hidden agenda is lobby money, donations, and corruption. Yeah, and we expect all of these things from SNC-Lavalin. Like, we expect them to be corrupt. We also expect the government is going to fight back on it. So basically, when Michael Wernick gets up there and says, I'm a public servant, I'm nonpartisan, he's doing this while discussing the viability of election prospects with the cabinet minister and with the prime minister. So I think it's safe to say that we are not talking about a significantly different perspective of what happened than what was laid out by Jody Wilson-Raybould. And I want to, again, point out this juxtaposition here. Gerald Butts said this morning that he didn't know a decision had been made by Jody Wilson-Raybould until last week. Wernick said that he knew back in September. And there were other discussions that took place that we were told of last week between Jody Wilson-Raybould's staff, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and other people in the PMO. So Elder Marquez, Matthew Bouchard, and the Chief of Staff to Bill Morneau, Ben Shin. And the reason this is important is because Elder Marquez and Matthew Bouchard know more than Butts does, but they report to him. So Butts was either not paying attention to things that were happening in his office, or he was deliberately obfuscating about what he knew and when he knew it. And that's where having the evidence, having the text messages, having the phone logs, having all of these things is a particularly important thing to do. So Michael Wernick's smugness and flippancy, I think, is and should be quite offensive to Canadians. And, you know, the one takeaway that I got from this is that in his worldview, and this is a guy, again, who's no spring chicken, he's been doing this for close to 4 decades. In his view, the public service shouldn't have to be accountable to the people. And it was clear he was growing increasingly frustrated and resentful of the fact that he's had to answer any questions about his conduct. And I think that's the very worst stereotype of the public service, that these people operate in the shadows, they're unelected, they're not held accountable. And there was one point where he was getting questions from Lisa Raitt that he didn't like. And he said, the Attorney General herself said last week no criminal conduct has taken place. And when he said this, the NDP and Conservative members of the committee actually started laughing at him. And one person, I don't know who it was, heckled like as though that's the only bar that matters. So his view is that, as long as we didn't break the law criminally, we're in the clear. No, I mean, we're talking about some more significant questions of political interference here that go beyond just that basic standard of obstructing justice that we hear about from the criminal code. Tommy writes, why do they even bother letting anyone testify if they're not under oath? Where is the RCMP in all of this? Well, the testifying under oath thing I find interesting. I mean, the fact that they voted against it is important. Their view is that, it's just not necessary. I'd say everyone testifying should always be under oath. Whereas the Liberal Justice Committee chair, Anthony Housefather, who I thought, again, has done a fairly good job on this up to this point, has said, well, it's already a crime to lie before a committee, so we don't need to put them under oath. But for symbolism alone, voting against putting someone under oath just sends a very bad message. But, when we have the other comments here, I mean, Sharon writes, what a farce. This committee is voting down 3 motions, liberal corruption at its best. Yeah, they're voting against putting them under oath, voting against tabling evidence. I mean, this was interesting. So Gerald Butts was reading from his prepared remarks. He worked with a lawyer on them, but he was reading from his prepared remarks. He read text messages. So he said, I texted this, Jody Wilson-Raybould texted this, and the Conservatives were saying, okay, let's submit these text messages so we can see them and see the context and see the text. And this is what happened, which was just so ridiculous. He said, well, I've read them in their totality. And the Liberals on the committee were like, oh, that's good enough. He says he's read them. We don't need to see them. So they justify in their own warped sense of justice that, okay, well, we can vote against putting them there. Imagine if in like a criminal case, like you could just say, I'm reading this letter that a man wrote where he said, I'm going to, murder my wife. And, we're going to convict him for murdering his wife. And, okay, submit the letter into evidence. No. He read it. He read it. It's good. He's already read it into evidence. We don't need to see it. Like, this is the farce that they're trying to pass off as being justice here. Laura writes, I cannot help but wonder what Trudeau is trying to keep our attention away from because this whole testimony committee appears to be a farce. Well, the thing is they're not succeeding in keeping people's attention away from this. The Liberals this morning announced that they're working towards a national pharmacare plan, and it had to be like the most or the least viewed announcement as far as any political announcement in the history of political announcements have gone. They had the former Ontario Health Minister Eric Hoskins out, and they were doing this, and like no one paid any attention. Like I had CBC on, and I was reading Twitter and news and all of this for like 8 hours today, and I didn't see anyone talking about it. I heard like 5 minutes about it on the morning radio, and that was it. So I think the Liberals are trying to get people to look away, but it's not working. But this committee, Liberal-dominated committee, has proven it is unable to investigate Liberals. And you could see this from the line of questioning. The question that the Liberals are asking the Privy Council clerk and the questions that the Liberals are asking Gerald Butts, they're like pretending to be tough questions. So you see like Randy Boissonneau from Edmonton is like, he's puffing his chest out and he's looking in and he's going, now, Mr. Butt. But again, like they're drinking buddies. Like, this is not a serious, hard-hitting question. It's not. So they're trying to make it look like they're taking this more seriously than they are. But if you want to see how unseriously they're taking it, just look at the actual votes. And when it comes to it, they voted against transparency, they voted against justice, and they voted against due process. And it's that simple. And then you've got like the Bloc Québécois guy, Louis Plamondon, who's like wasting 5 minutes at the beginning saying, it's my God-given right to, have testimony in English and in French. Like they're more offended about the lack of official bilingualism than they are about the lack of due process in all of these other areas. So this is now, as Corey points out, stalled until the 19th. Liberals are hoping people lose interest. I believe that the committee needs to recall Jody Wilson-Raybould. This was the other thing that happened. The Liberals voted against bringing Jody Wilson-Raybould back to the committee to testify, whereas she, I think, needs to be able to respond to the refutations of her claims that were given by Wernick and by Gerald Butts. And this is, if they do not let her testify again, they will have no credibility and no moral authority whatsoever. We've got to wrap things up. We will be following this in the days and weeks to come. But if you have a Liberal member of Parliament, call them and demand justice. We're at that point where people need to speak up. For True North, I'm Andrew Lawton. Thank you, God bless, and good day, Canada.